And now, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe, it's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, will I still be able to recycle my bed mattress if the fire department got it wet? And can a memory care facility improve my aging grandfather's quality of life, or is it really just all about the hot widows with Medicaid? And now, the podcast host whose TV appearances scream, yes, I'm a naked mole rat who shops at Army-Navy surplus, Pete Dominic.
Yes, that's right, Pete Co. Watching MSNBC on Saturday night. Thank you very much for those of you who did. We had a great conversation with Liz Plank, Eugene Daniels, and the great Ayman Mohyeldin hosting Saturday and Sunday night. Hopefully that becomes a more regular thing because I really enjoyed that. Also, last week tonight, I opened for John Oliver, warmed up the audience at HBO's Last Week Tonight, so hopefully you guys watch that. I have an awesome show for you today. Dr. Peter Hotez, one of the most respected scientists and vaccine experts in the country and the world, really joins me, as does our favorite historian, the great Kenneth C. Davis, talking about Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day and all of that. Happy Columbus Day. Hope you had a great fall weekend. We did here. Val is back from Italy. Ava had an amazing, successful weekend and trip into New York City with her 16-year-old friends. Everybody had a great time, and I'm really happy that they did that. Hopefully you guys are free-ranging your kids and sending them off to do things and not being terrified of every little thing, because our society certainly can condition us that way. I'm not judging you if that's the case. I always want to have a conversation about that, but I'm really happy that we have raised the girls as free range as we can, sending them in New York City. Ava and her 16-year-old friends had an awesome, awesome time. All right, so Dr. Peter Hotez, Professor Kenneth C. Davis, both join me, but I give you three reasons to listen every day. Not only do I pretty much have two awesome guests every day, usually smart experts on things, but hopefully at least a great conversation with a super thoughtful person. Maybe that person is you. Let me know if you'd like to join me here on the show, and I'll get back to you for sure. So I've also got the news. Two great guests and the news. But also want to remind you, I will be in Orlando this week, this Wednesday night and Thursday night. But Wednesday night, I am going to try to get together with some people. I think Dr. Barry Hummel's reached out to me, and a couple of others have as well. I haven't gotten back to, but I will get back to everybody and let you know where I'm going to be on Wednesday night in Orlando. If anybody just wants to come out for drinks, I am working with Florida Education Association, my good friend Andrew Spar, going to be moderating a conversation at their annual gathering. They're doing amazing work. The Florida Education Association representing more teachers than anybody in Florida. An awesome, awesome union, and very excited to be joining my friend Andrew and everybody working at that organization. But I'm going to come down a day early, make sure I get there on time. So this Wednesday night, Orlando, if you want to grab drinks with me, hopefully we can make that happen with a few people or more. All right, so let's get to the news, shall we? It is time for the last 24. A lot going on this weekend. Okay, so we had the former disgraced, twice impeached president back out on the campaign trail, of course, in Iowa. So he isn't announcing yet because for several smart reasons that he doesn't want to take responsibility or ownership over things like the midterms and more. He doesn't want to, he wants everybody to be able to send his money directly to him and not the campaign. So he's not making it formal, but he basically is running the campaign. He's in Iowa this weekend, making an ass of himself, promoting the big lie, where he still has massive approval amongst the death cult of folks following him. And lots to say about that coming up. Speaking of the former president, President Biden rejected the Trump effort to withhold January 6th records, so credit to the Biden administration on that. The job numbers came out for September. Disappointing job numbers, 194,000 additions in September. Economists expected the figure to be a lot higher, but the Delta variant of the COVID pandemic has really, I think most experts are pointing to that being the reason why job numbers weren't higher. And, of course, it's really hard to follow. If you're not paying attention to the news for a day, you would have missed that an appeals court in Texas overruled the federal district judge who had blocked the Texas anti-woman bill. Okay, so Texas passes this anti-woman bill, and a federal judge says you can't do that, completely unconstitutional. And then the radical right Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the law that bans most abortions after 6 weeks should be temporarily reinstated after this federal judge blocked its implementation earlier last week. Got a clip on that for you. Brazil became the second country to surpass 600,000 COVID deaths, and nearly 140 countries have agreed to a global tax overhaul, which I think is interesting and I want to dig into with some experts over the next couple of weeks. I think that's important and interesting. But I got some scary shit to play for you here at the top, so brace yourself with the predictions that we're hearing from people like Chris Krebs and Fiona Hill in these next couple of clips. But let's first start with the brilliant Mehdi Hasan, who on his show on MSNBC last night had this 2-minute kind of commentary, which ends on a pretty ominous note and includes some audio from people like Trump in Iowa and Kevin McCarthy and more. I think this is a really important thing to hear, as tough and as disconcerting as it is.
Months after the storming of the United States Capitol, the attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 election is still underway. We are in the midst of a rolling coup. Almost every day, Republicans pass more voter suppression laws. They purge more and more election officials, and they entrench the big lie that the election was stolen. Just check out this weekend.
And the Republicans have to stay strong. You have to stay strong. You have to fight. Bring our country back.
Do you feel that enough has been done for a free and fair election for these congressional races in 2022?
Yeah, we are making great improvements, and as you say, 18 states. But we're also being able to stop H.R. 1, where the Democrats would have greater control of our election, of what we could actually say a speech czar, to make the Democrats have greater control when it comes to the Federal Election Commission. And these states is where the rules need to change. We need to clean the rolls up, like in Los Angeles. There's more than 1.2 million people on the rolls. That's more than who are old enough to actually register to vote.
Are we going to follow what the Constitution says or not? I hope we get back to what the Constitution says, but clearly in a number of states, they didn't follow those legislatively set rules.
So you think the election was stolen?
What I said is there are states that didn't follow their legislatively set rules. It's the words of GOP Congressman Steve Scalise there that are the most chilling to me. He's carefully foreshadowing what the GOP position is likely to be come 2024. Not just election fraud, but making sure that Republican state legislatures will have the power to pick each slate of presidential electors. Never mind voters and their pesky, votes. In a democracy, the Republicans want to unilaterally decide who runs the country. It's all about election subversion now. Mark my words, if Donald Trump is the 2024 Republican presidential nominee and Republicans control the House of Representatives, they will not certify a Democratic victory in 2024.
All right, Mehdi Hasan, tough to argue with that, and it's scary as hell, but I had to share it with you. I think that's important. Take your vitamins. This is important. We all have to get active and stay woke and contributing to others' campaigns, maybe running yourself. All right, I also wanted to play for you Fiona Hill, who is a former Trump White House advisor. She was a senior director at the National Security Council, a key witness in President Trump's first impeachment trial. She was on CBS with Margaret Brennan talking about her new book, There's Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. Here is Fiona Hill with a warning of her own.
In the book Peril, Robert Costa and Bob Woodward wrote, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, at the end of it, is quoted as comparing the January 6th siege of the Capitol to the Great Dress Rehearsal. You're a Russia analyst. You know immediately what that phrase is, which is what Lenin called an uprising that preceded the revolution. I read that and I said, dear God.
Yeah.
I mean, the general is saying that this is a precursor potentially to further violence. Is this overstating things in a historical sense?
He's not overstating it at all because, we all saw in real time what happened on January 6th at the Capitol building. And General Milley was absolutely right. Any student of history, but any observer of even American politics over the last decade. I mean, when have we seen something like this before? We haven't. Not in our lifetimes. We've seen episodes, particularly during the civil rights movement and, of course, during Vietnam, where there were protests, but storming the Capitol building of the United States. I mean, this is exactly the thing that you think of historically in revolutions, storming the Bastille during the French Revolution, storming the Winter Palace during the Russian Revolution that General Milley was alluding to. And as he was saying, we've seen many historical episodes where there is violence, people discount it, they think that this is just a passing occurrence. Vice President Pence has been downplaying it. Even though he would have been targeted, he was targeted. They wanted to lynch him. And then, people sweeping this away, saying nothing happened here. And the next time around, you get the real thing where people actually do seize those major buildings. And I said that also in the book, that this was, in effect, a dress rehearsal for something that could be happening near term in 2022, 2024. We've got election cycles here that will heighten the tensions. And once people start talking about violence, once a threshold is crossed, we're in a danger zone.
Historian, national security expert, former Trump administration National Security Council member Fiona Hill, her new book was on CBS Margaret Brennan. Also on that same show, Face the Nation, she had Chris Krebs, who is also a former Trump administration cybersecurity director, and this is what he had to say on Face the Nation.
Talking about politics, you ran the rumor control site for the 2020 election in your previous role when you were within Homeland Security. What you said and the work you did on that is one of the reasons why President Trump fired you. Last night, he again stood at a rally in Iowa and called for the complete overhaul of our election systems. These calls are not going away. Do you think that there is an active effort underway to undermine elections, as Congressman Schiff started off our program saying?
Without question, it's happening at 4 different levels, both state legislatures and state elected officials, some of the folks running for Secretary of State in Arizona and Georgia, but we're also seeing in the U.S. Congress. The minority whip was on Fox News this morning with Chris Wallace, and he was talking about how the election was effectively stolen. And he will not admit that President Biden won fair and square. And so what we're seeing is Congressman Schiff mentioned, is this constant erosion of confidence in the electoral system, and it is ultimately anti-democratic. And we're frankly in a death spiral, as I see it. And 2 years, 4 years at the ballot box isn't good enough, and there have to be other accountability measures for those that are going to continue to proliferate these lies.
Yeah, also Chris Krebs said, him being a self-described lifelong Republican, he told Margaret Brennan that Republicans in Congress, in office, are afraid to speak up because they're afraid the former president is going to primary them. And there's a lot worse than that, just my own commentary. They're also afraid that they're going to get killed by crazy Trumpers who will show up at their house or place of work. That's not an irrational concern, unfortunately.
I mean, it's captured by the base, right? I mean, they're afraid to speak up because they're afraid the former president is going to try to primary them. And then the other piece is that they've activated and lost control of their voting base, the people that are going to put them in power. And they know that if they go against the former president, that not only will he speak out against them, but they're going to start seeing people show up at their town halls. I mean, you've actually seen Republican members of Congress stop holding town halls because they've overactivated their base and it's gotten out of control. Again, this is a death spiral. They've lost control and they don't have the ability to rein it back in.
All right. Well, those first 4 clips are really uplifting, huh? You feeling good about the future of the country? Oh, my God. Death spiral. Whew. Well, how are we going to get out of this one? I don't know, but no matter what, we're going up or down together with each other. So let's stick tight and keep talking and do our best to stay in reality and be as positive, optimistic, support each other, and keep on fighting. No matter what happens, we just got to keep on talking, keep on fighting. And I love this community, and I'm going to do it side by side with you. So was that an inspiring and uplifting? What am I trying to be fake Ted Lasso. By the way, I loved the season finale of Ted Lasso. It is probably my favorite show of all time. I gotta say it. So good. If you're not watching, please do. Okay, so finally, I don't know why I said finally. I got several more clips for you, but this is Dr. Scott Gottlieb. I guess what I meant finally from CBS. This is the last clip I'm pulling from CBS's Face the Nation. Here is Margaret Brennan talking with Scott Gottlieb about some latest developments on vaccines. Who's going to get them next?
Pfizer applied for emergency approval for children ages 5 to 11 to be able to get a vaccine. Is it reasonable to assume that by Thanksgiving we could see children fully vaccinated?
I think that's certainly reasonable in terms of when this would be available. FDA is meeting October 26th, their advisory committee, to discuss this application, assuming that they authorize the use of the vaccine. CDC's advisory committee is going to meet on November 2nd and 3rd and make a final decision about who should be eligible for the vaccine. And assuming both of those events go well and you get a positive recommendation out of both the FDA and the CDC, this should be available almost immediately after the CDC makes a final recommendation and be available in pharmacies and perhaps pediatricians' offices as well. Pfizer plans to ship this vaccine in smaller vials and also smaller trays that could make it more accessible to more pediatric practices.
All right, the always electric Scott Gottlieb. He just doesn't have a ton of personality on those appearances, at least. Maybe he does in real life. All right, let's go back to some more political news analysis with Yamiche Alcindor, who I think is great. I'm not a big Chuck Todd fan or Meet the Press fan at this point, but I think she's one of the best reporters out there. Real good at explaining stuff. And here's her take. Let's back to politics about Republicans. And, well, I just think this is a great clip. Listen to what she says.
Well, Yamiche, the other thing is there seems to be no power in numbers. Everybody's afraid of, if they all join hands, they could rid the party of Trump, but they're not doing it.
They're not. And really at the heart of this is fear. And at the heart of this is the idea that the threat continues. Watching the Trump rally yesterday, and I would only do it because I was coming on Meet the Press with you, Chuck. I watched it from beginning to end. And what I saw yesterday was a president who is continuing to not only lie, but also up the ante. He was telling people last night, we're not going to have a country in 3 years. We need to take this country back. And what you see is a Republican Party that simply cannot divorce themselves from the alternate reality that the former president is living in. And you see people riled up, excited about that. And in talking to Democrats, they're just so worried that the energy is on the GOP side.
All right. Good stuff from Yamiche. And she's also a really cool person. I've met her several times, interviewed her a couple times as well. Very, very good. So let me move on to say with Meet the Press, but let's talk hear from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island. Here he is the Judiciary on the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. They have an investigation into former President Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election. And so he sat down on Meet the Press and kind of explained where they're at. I think this is super important to follow.
I want to start with, I know that you were limited in your investigation because you're the Judiciary Committee, and this was about the actions of the Department of Justice. So how complete of a picture do you think you have of what President Trump did, and what more would you like to know?
Well, we have a very complete picture of the extent to which Trump was personally involved in this. This is a question in which you can actually connect the President of the United States to the scheme. The second thing that we know is that it focused very heavily on Georgia. So that relates and feathers into the Georgia prosecution that's underway, I should say the investigation that's underway down in Fulton County. Those two things link up. What we don't know is who was really behind this. The text of the transcript and the body English of the witnesses suggests that they had very little regard for this character, Jeffrey Clark, who was nominally going to be the new Attorney General. They doubted his qualifications to even have that role. So it's a possibility, I suppose, that he saw this moment and grabbed it. But it's an equally real possibility that he was a cog in a larger machine. And we've got a lot of work to do to figure out how that machine ran through this period, who was behind it, where the money came from, and what's been going on.
You think it's somebody other than Donald Trump? I mean, when I hear that, you're essentially saying you believe there's somebody else involved, somebody else was pulling the strings. Who could that be besides Donald Trump?
We don't know yet. But This guy jumped to a dark money enterprise. So he's been taken care of, Jeffrey Clark. There was a lot of activity around this with members of Congress. There's just a lot left to be learned. And particularly, as the old saw goes, follow the money. Who was paying for this stuff, and how did it all work?
All right, Sheldon Whitehouse on Meet the Press. All right, little palate cleanser for you. I mean, maybe not really, because it's still kind of politics and serious conversation, but it is with George Clooney. How about that? Because I got a few more clips after this, so I figure let's listen to Clooney. I think he's a smart and thoughtful man. He was on the BBC being interviewed by Andrew Marr about his upcoming film project, and he's always been the subject of rumors that he might consider running. So he squashed that and said more. And so here he is, the sexiest man alive twice, George Clooney.
You're a man you're a Democrat, but you're slightly to the left, as it were, in American politics.
Sure.
You're a friend of President Biden. You've known him for a long time.
Sure.
And looking at his poll numbers, which are really quite bad at the moment, things have gone wrong. What would you say about what's happened to the White House since he's taken over, and what's happened to America since he's taken over?
Well, I mean, you can't. It's like taking a battered child and thinking everything's going to be okay, and his first day in school. There's a lot of things that have to be repaired. There's a lot of healing that has to happen, and it's going to take time. Poll numbers come up and go down. I would expect them to go back up again. Donald Trump's numbers went up and down. He's
still there, prowling around in the rhododendrons.
Sure.
Yeah.
He's going to be a factor for a while. It's so funny because he was just this knucklehead. I knew him before he was, a president. He was just a guy who was chasing girls. Every time you went out, he'd come over and be like, "What's the name of that girl?" That's all he was. And the idea that there's this whole group of people that, that they think he's the champion of, which he certainly can't stand in real life. But, he's going to play this out for a while, and we'll see where we go with it as a country. My hope is we have a little better sense than to do that again. My hope.
We've talked about politics in the past and again today, and you're very fluent on this. At your age and stage, a lot of people are looking forward for the next big thing. Do you ever see yourself, like some other actors, going into politics?
No. No, because I actually would like to have a nice life. I turned 60 this year, and I had a conversation with my wife, and I said, we're working a lot, as we both do. And I said, we have to think of these as the halcyon years. If we have our health, which we do, knock on wood for a minute, and I'm 60 and I can, still play basketball and still do the things I love. But in 20 years, I'll be 80, and that's a real number. Doesn't matter how much you work out, doesn't matter how, what you eat, you're 80. And so I said, we have to make sure we enjoy and live these years in the best possible way.
And by that, George Clooney means in his castle in Italy and his several other mansions and doing whatever the hell he and his wife want to the rest of their life. I don't know. I thought that was fun. Okay, so let me now play for you some analysis from Maggie Haberman, who a lot of people love to hate, because she does a lot of access journalism and kind of palace intrigue. But she also, bottom line is she has access and pretty good analysis, I think, at least, about Donald Trump, who he is, his behavior, who he's talking to, what he's doing, what his strategy is. And I don't know, I thought this was pretty good analysis. So here you are from ABC's This Week, Maggie Haberman.
But Maggie Haberman is our resident Trump expert. Let me begin with you. We saw the president former president in Iowa last night, making no pretense about wanting to run again.
I think what you're going to hear him do is some strange dance between talking about the future, make America great again, and his sloganeering, but he can't stop talking about the past. And that's the one thing that I think is striking about Pence's statement, which we should note. I think that people are focused on January 6th because January 6th was a horrible day, not because they're trying to demean Trump supporters, but Trump is focused on looking backwards to a degree that his party does not want him to. But many members of his party, not everybody, many members of his party are not willing to say to him, this is not the way forward. Pence is not saying it directly to him. I think the number of voices who are willing to do that have so far been very few.
All right, let's get off Trump for a second and get to the current president, Joe Biden, and his agenda. By the way, I'm going to do my best to try to sell this agenda. I really, truly believe in this Build Back Better major investment into our country, our society, our people. And I think it will be good for everybody from right to left. I think it's nothing but winners. Honestly, it's huge. And I want to do whatever I can to help sell it and promote it and put pressure to pass it and to have voters and citizens understand what it meant. So I'll be talking more about that. But here's Julie Pace of the Associated Press on ABC's This Week talking about what I think is some pretty smart but disconcerting political analysis about the bill and its politics, which are not as important as its impact and policy, but still, here it is.
This is the big challenge for Biden. He's going to spend this whole year fighting to get some package finished, and the top line number will be really massive. But a lot of that spending is not going to be implemented next year. So he's going to be out there trying to argue for why he spent this time focused on this issue. And a lot of Americans won't have felt concrete benefits of it. And that is a really difficult messaging challenge for them right now. And I do think that they have to worry about this going into the midterms next year. How will Americans feel about what they benefited from all of this sausage making that we've seen in Washington?
She's not wrong about that. Julie Pace with good analysis about the potential politics and timeline of this bill getting passed. All right, and now this one's going to get you probably pretty annoyed because it's got Chris Christie in it arguing with Donna Brazile, and ridiculous what he says here. He's just becoming more and more absurd. But like I told you last week, you're hearing a whole bunch of right-wingers act like the Biden Justice Department is targeting Americans who just want to have their grievances heard at school board meetings. No, the Justice Department and the Biden administration are concerned about violence because there's a tremendous amount of violence and threats and problems. That's what we're talking about. But of course, Chris Christie tries to act like that's not the case, and he rewrites history about Bush's attorney general acting like he was not partisan after 9/11. Are you fucking kidding me, Mr. Single-digit approval rating? All right, here it is. He had single-digit approval rating when he left governor in New Jersey. Just saying.
Respect you. And I think it's what Merrick Garland's got to decide to do. And I think, he hurt himself this week with some of the stuff he's doing regarding parents and education. It makes him look partisan. I think he needs to get back to what the Justice Department is supposed to do, which is dispassionately look at the facts like they did after 9/11, like the Ashcroft Justice Department did then. And I think that's the way they have to go and do it. And if he does it that way, then he has an opportunity to do something important for the country.
Chris, no teacher should be threatened simply because he or she is trying to do their job. No school board member.
It depends on what you call a threat, Donna. Parents standing up for what they want is not a threat.
A threat is when you verbally assault someone and threaten their lives, which is happening across this country.
Donna,
and I'm so glad the Justice Department decided to take a position.
Well, let me just say this. The Justice Department can individually in each U.S. Attorney's Office investigate those things. We don't need broad political pronouncements from the White House and the Justice Department. It politicizes the Justice Department.
Continuation of January 6th, and we should not allow that to happen.
That is all we have time for today. We'll be right back.
And that's a good place to end. I got one more clip for you, but in terms of it's a continuation of January 6th, as you just heard the brilliant Donna Brazile say. I think it's so important, and we need, said earlier at the very beginning as well, that it's an unfolding, ongoing coup. It's the attempt is being made right now to usurp future elections and past elections and reelect Donald Trump, which is just impossible to fathom. Really, really a tough thing to imagine. But we'll take it one day at a time here on Stand Up, and I'll be here with you each day. And finally, I want to play one more clip. This is, again, back to the beginning. MSNBC's Mehdi Hasan had Nancy Northrup on, who's the CEO of a very important organization supporting women, Center for Reproductive Rights CEO, Nancy Northrup. Here is Mehdi Hasan sitting in for Ali Velshi on MSNBC Saturday. This is important about the Texas abortion law.
Nancy, let me start with you. Reports indicate that a handful of Texas clinics had resumed providing abortions after Judge Pittman's ruling, including Whole Woman's Health, which is the clinic you represent in this lawsuit. What does last night's appellate court ruling mean for them now?
Well, it's just heartbreaking. Whole Woman's Health did step right in and begin providing services after Judge Pittman's excellent ruling. And this morning, there are patients whose procedures were canceled after that late night ruling yesterday. And I just want to bring everyone back to the fact that these are constitutionally protected services. You have a right to an abortion up to pre-viability, way past 6 weeks of pregnancy. And what is happening in Texas is the rights of people are being just flat out denied. It's just outrageous what the Fifth Circuit did last night.
All right, there you go. Nancy Northrup on Velshi with Mehdi Hassan hosting. And that is the roundup of audio that I've got for you today. But now, of course, there's just a few more headlines. I always like to squeeze in, mention, uncovered stories, and more. It's time for the news dump. This news dump written by listener Adam in Maryland and, of course, recorded and performed by the great Pete Coe.
Lou Dobbs sees in his prompter Spanish name he's stumped. He'll try it anyway for today's news dump.
The Mexican city of Huartulda.
That's great. Oh, I like that. I like the idea of including audio. Where is Lou Dobbs? Is that new? Or did you guys just come up with an old news story but a new news dump? By the way, I loved it, and I love it when you guys collaborate. Adam in Maryland, very funny. As always, Pete Coe, thank you very much. All right, here we go. Let's start with the weekend box office, which is a thing again. After over 18 months of pandemic delays, a new Bond film, No Time to Die, starring the gorgeous Daniel Craig. I'm straight +1 for him. Opened on target, the final James Bond film of the Daniel Craig era grossed $56 million, and it's now in the first place spot. Didn't break any pandemic or 007 records, apparently, according to the Associated Press, but it didn't fall significantly short either, and it's the fourth best opening in 25 film series. I am excited to see that movie. Sad or tragic news coming out of Lebanon, my ancestors' homeland. The two main power plants were forced to shut down after running out of fuel. State electricity company said on Saturday, leaving the tiny country with no government-produced power, and they said it's unlikely that it'll work till next Monday for several days. Lebanon grappling with a crippling energy crisis made worse by its dependency on fuel imports. And speaking, here's another story just kind of related to fuel, which is, I like this, new California law is going to ban the sale of new gas-powered leaf blowers and lawn mowers, which would curb emissions from a category of small engines on pace to produce more pollution each year than passenger vehicles. And join me in 2015 when I first bought a battery-powered lawnmower. I've got the Ego line of tools. So does listener Dan McDonald. We have shared our tools. In fact, he shared his with me at one point, and then I went and bought a new weed whacker. I got the blower, I got the weed whacker, I got the mower, and the hedge trimmers. They all run on lithium battery power and off of my solar panels. So come on, join me. Join the movement and let me know if you do and when you do. If you buy new equipment, if you get solar panels, electric car, send me pictures. It's very arousing to me. And while we're talking about it, I mentioned that I did the audience warm-up for John Oliver's show on HBO last week tonight, and I was watching last week's episode, and he did the entire segment on what's called PFAS, which are a chemical that's been linked to all kinds of health problems. Super important story. I highly recommend you go watch that episode. But the EPA, Biden's EPA, of course, announced it's going to unveil a plan to address what it sees as inadequate regulations on this class of toxic chemicals that I'm telling you about that disproportionately affect all kinds of folks, including vulnerable groups, according to a bunch of documents obtained by journalists at The Hill and other outlets with a Freedom of Information Act. Super important, and I highly recommend that you watch that. And this is a great move by the EPA, and probably very late. A lot of people gotten sick or died as a result of this. And so it's super important that we are addressing it, or at least attempting to. Southwest Airlines canceling more than 1,000 flights on Sunday. The long weekend got a bit longer for Southwest customers, says CNN Business, after the airline canceled more than 1,000 flights, roughly 27% of their daily operations. Second day of mass cancellations by the world's largest low-cost carrier. The company blamed the cancellations on air traffic control problems and limited staffing in Florida, as well as bad weather. And how about this? New study says 25% of all critical infrastructure in the U.S. is at risk of failure due to flooding. Report also found nearly 2 million miles of road. 23% of U.S. roadways are already at risk of becoming impassable due to flooding. New report released by the First Street Foundation, a nonprofit research and technology group that assesses the threat posed by flooding across the country. Super important story. Read it at CNN Business. The Biden administration's task force to reunited families separated under Trump has reported that they've reunited 52 families. And that's not nearly enough, but it's something. It's a start. Update was included in a new report from 60 Minutes that aired on Sunday. And apparently wind delayed the Blue Origin flight that has got Captain Kirk on it. William Shatner's space attempt is going to have to wait. Blue Origin announced yesterday that its mission operations team decided to push the launch back one day from Tuesday into Wednesday because of forecasted winds. Godspeed, Captain Kirk. Sorry. There's a terrible story. R. Kelly's album sales grew by 500% after his conviction. He's seen double-digit gains in streams and triple-digit growth in sales since he was declared guilty on all charges against him. That's like that white country star who said the N-word, which is not nearly as bad as what R. Kelly did. I'm not equating the two, but still, someone behaving badly to any extent gives you publicity and sells, in this case, your albums. Pretty disappointing. And here's two great stories at the end. After 29 days lost at sea, 2 men were rescued. They survived on oranges and rainwater, apparently. They're from the Solomon Islands. They were traveling to another island when heavy rain and wind took them out to sea. They survived on oranges that they packed, and then they found coconuts. And they gathered rainwater and somehow survived. Amazing, amazing story. Read that at The Guardian. They said it was a nice break from everything. Oh, that's amazing. I got to talk to these guys. And one more nice story at the end here of the news dump. A toddler who was missing for 3 days has been found safe in the woods near Magnolia, Texas. Alive and well. Christopher Ramirez reunited with his mother, smiling, drinking water, and in good shape. Wow. Boy disappeared on Wednesday afternoon, moments after returning home from running errands with mother and grandmother. He chased a neighbor's dog while his parents were unloading the car. The dog returned, the kid didn't. The family started looking for him. They called the police, and hundreds of volunteers showed up. And finally, a Good Samaritan located the child miles from where he'd gone missing. And it's just a great, great story. A great story coming out of Texas. How about that? There you go. Almost 35 minutes of news recap from the weekend. Thank you very much for joining me, folks. I'm really happy to have you here for whatever reason you are joining me. I was just thinking and talking with friends about it over the weekend, about how grateful I am to have your support, to be able to do this work every day and bring you these great conversations and news, recaps and analysis each and every day. Please tell your friends about the show so we can keep it going. Sign up now at standupwithpete.com or go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Do it now. If you haven't, I don't know what you're waiting for. Come on. The show is free, but it isn't cheap for me. So please show up and support it with a paid subscription. Okay. So, joining me now, coming up, I should say, I've got Professor, the great Kenneth C. Davis, the author of the Don't Know Much series of history books. So many good books talking about, it is Columbus Day, so we talked about indigenous people, we talked about Columbus, we talked about the real history, we talked about history in general, the politics about history. That's all coming up. But first, I've got one of the most respected scientists in the country joining me. He and I go back because he had written an amazing book about his daughter, Rachel, who has autism. It's called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. And I interviewed him for that years ago, long before the COVID epidemic, and I found him to be just a great guy and a smart guy and really good at communicating. And so we talked several times before COVID happened, and then I left SiriusXM, but he continued to join me even though he's getting requests from all the biggest media and news outlets in the country. He's always happy and cool to join me here in the shed. Of course, Dr. Hotez is now widely known all over the country as one of the most respected scientists and doctors when it comes to epidemiology or vaccine creation, because he's created his own vaccines, and he's creating a new vaccine right now that he and his team have been working on we talk about that. He's a scientist, a pediatrician, an advocate, global health, vaccinology, neglected tropical diseases as well. He's the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine, professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, another good thing in Texas. Also director of Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development. And I mean, I could just go on and fill up a lot of time with his intro and his accolades and the papers that he's published and awards that he's gotten. But Dr. Peter Hotez on Twitter at Peter Hotez. Please let him know that you heard him here on the show and that you appreciate it, and that always encourages folks to come back here and join me at Peter Hotez. And I start right now. Okay, there he is, Dr. Peter Hotez, and I am so happy to have you joining me again. Thank you for doing this show. I'll try to ask you questions that you haven't been asked to some extent, and more importantly, give you some time that you don't normally get. I'm glad you're doing all these.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to see you. I just thought I'd check in, see how you're doing. You look terrific. You look like $1 million. And
thank you.
Good.
You're always so kind to me. Just filled with compliment. You look great. Your hair looks really good as usual. You've got it.
So, yeah, it's just I spent hours quaffing it for you.
When I asked somebody, I asked before I was going to meet you tonight on Twitter. I said, I get to interview Dr. Peter Hotez because, I'm a big deal. I have a shed. And he, what should I ask him? And someone said, does messy hair equate with intelligence? Is that why you're so smart? Because you don't really do a lot?
Only when it's accompanied with a mustache and a bow tie.
I know. It's
the bow tie that, it starts, then the IQ points start accumulating.
I got to get a bow. I only got one. I think that says a lot about me.
And part of the affectation is you don't tie it perfectly, right? So it's a bit off, so they know that you actually tied it rather than a clip-on. So that's very smart. Messiness.
So now that you're basically, public health famous, which is not a terrible thing to be. I mean, we can talk about how it's probably not been great for you in many ways. But are people sending you bow tie? I imagine people want to send.
They have. I've had some people. One wonderful gentleman said, he's retired. He's nearly not wearing his bow ties anymore, and sent me a bunch. And another one sent me one made out of bird feathers, which is quite exotic.
Wow. Very cool. Yeah. I knew that. People, I like to think that a lot more people respect and appreciate and love you. But the hate is.
One sent me some bow ties from a very fancy men's store on Savile Row in London, and I've never owned anything from Savile Row in London, so I thought that was great.
That's a very cool. Some great fringe benefits. But
the problem now is if I stop wearing a bow tie or God forbid a regular tie, it's like when Dylan started playing electric instruments at the Newport Folk Festival. It's like no.
Listen, sir. I mean, I have a great deal of respect for you, but now you're comparing yourself to Bob Dylan. I'm starting to get concerned.
You get the idea. You get the metaphor.
Do you, like Bob Dylan, just go into a 7-Eleven and read the newspaper and hope no one recognizes you? I saw that yesterday that he does that. Peter Hotez can't go anywhere anymore. I mean, I bet. How has it been in terms of the ugliness? I know that you're good friends with my good friend, Dr. Michael Mann, and you guys have something great in common. You're basically at the top of your game in terms of climate science and everything that you do, vaccines and virology and everything else. You have like 800 degrees, and yet people have been attacking the science that you've been doing as well for a long time, and a lot of the same people. Have you been able to kind of bond and commiserate and share ideas with people?
He's been wonderful. He's a wonderful man.
He is.
I didn't know you knew him. I just got to know him over this pandemic, over all the anti-science aggression and comparing notes. And and I think there's some similar forces there. I think this is the difference, from, we've talked about the anti-vaccine movement even before the pandemic. And, we've spoken, and I think the evolving situation is the institutionalization of anti-vaccine, anti-science aggression, and how now it's a signature program of far-right extremism. Not even that far-right anymore, becoming increasingly mainstream across segments of the GOP, and that really worries me a lot. It never used to be that way, and the way it's manifesting is not only trying to discredit the science. You got to take ivermectin instead of getting vaccinated in this nonsense. And it's so self-defeating, and it's a killer, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But also, includes targeting scientists that we're now seen as an enemy of the people, and since I'm one of the top of the heap, I'm the lead enemies of the people, and the scary emails and threats, and the army of patriots is going to hunt me down in this crap.
I'm so sorry to hear that. I'm not surprised by it.
What I say is, why do you need an army of patriots? It's just me and Ann and Rachel and the cat. I would think one patriot, maybe two patriots.
Stop. I want to find out.
You got to laugh, right? Otherwise, you just jump out the window.
I want to find out, though. The truth is about Dr. Peter Hotez that he is actually highly trained in hand-to-hand combat. He's like John Wick meets Jason Bourne. I mean, I wouldn't mess with you. I know that you could take a guy out if need be. I'm sure.
Well, in academic circles, yes, our major weapon of choice in the college is faint praise. I can dole that out.
That's great. Well, I don't know how that's going to work with some of these folks, but give it your best shot. What is working? I mean, you've made so many appearances in every single forum that you can to try to educate people. Is it just continuing to repeat the science and hoping that people, the faith in experts like yourself at some point will stop deteriorating based on time passing and science kind of bearing out the truth?
Well, one of the things that I do, since unlike a lot of talking heads, is I've been working on coronavirus vaccines for a decade. So, and there are not many of us in the country that have been working on coronaviruses. So I can, there's a lot of depth and breadth behind the statements that I make because I've been doing this for a long time. And I think that's helpful because, one of the things that I do is I don't try to dumb it down. There's this thing out there that says you're supposed to talk to the American people like they're in the 4th grade or the 6th grade. And I think that's actually quite off-putting. I think all of those ideas were cemented and put in place before something called the internet came along, and people are a lot more sophisticated now. And if their lives depend on it, or the lives of their loved ones depend on it, they're willing to tolerate some complexity. So one of the things that I do is I try to provide the assumptions for the statements I make, and why we need a booster, and why in fact I've been saying since the beginning this is a 3-dose vaccine based on the kinetics of the immune response and how you give those first 2 doses, and then of course with the trolls all say no you didn't, you're just making that up, and I have to provide evidence from past interviews that yes I actually did say that, but I said it was logical because, and here's why, and then that gives people some comfort because they realize that a lot of the things they're being told from White House or from the CDC are not just coming out of the blue. It actually has a lot of basis and history behind it. And that's comforting. And that's the problem with the White House and a lot of the CDC communication. It's still that kind of old-fashioned way of doing it that, we're the Centers for Disease Control. We're going to talk to you like you're in the 6th grade, and here's our summary statement. Then it freaks people out.
Well, all that being said, and I appreciate that that's how you handle it, I kind of would love to have you analogize or a metaphor for how important the vaccine developments that have been made, including the one that you've been developing, how important are they? How has the science around them changed, these RNA vaccines? And now, yesterday, I do have to get your take on the WHO director announcing a malaria vaccine, which an epidemiologist friend of mine said, we shouldn't get too excited. Maybe it's a little overblown, but I want to get your take on just the technology over the past year and how things have ramped up and how big of a deal it is if there's any kind of metaphor for it or analogy.
Well, so here it is. So about a decade ago, we began working on coronavirus vaccines because there was SARS, and we said, you know what, there's going to be another major coronavirus pandemic coming out of China, and that's why we started working on it. So that's important, too, to say that COVID-19 was both predicted and predictable. And that's when we began doing work showing that the spike protein was the target of the virus, how you deliver the spike protein, how you induce virus neutralizing antibodies to the spike protein. And all that work, that 10 years of research and development, went into our current vaccines. The problem was that the CEOs of the companies, when the CEOs send out a press release, it's not meant for you or for me. It's meant for the shareholders to jack up their stock prices. And what they tend to do is spectacularize their accomplishments and made it seem like they appeared out of nowhere just because they're so amazing. And I understand why they did it, but it was tone deaf to the fact that people would say, what the heck's going on? Maybe these things aren't legit. How could they come out of nowhere? Everyone knows it takes years or decades to make vaccines. And they're right, it does. And it did.
Right.
But it wasn't messaged that way. So, then it's a question of how you deliver the spike protein. And our way of doing it was to make it as a recombinant protein. And it's an older school method that takes longer. Whereas with mRNA or adenovirus, you can get to the clinic much faster. The problem is you can't make billions of it. And that's where our vaccine's coming across now, is that we've done the technology transfer now to India and Indonesia, and where India is now making 100 million doses a month. And the hope is our vaccine is going to be the one that winds up vaccinating the world. So even though we're slower on the front end, on the back end, because it's an older technology with widespread capacity to make billions and billions of doses, hopefully ours could be the one that vaccinates the world. But in the meantime, you had these mRNA and adenovirus vectored vaccines that could immunize the American people pretty quickly. And that was great. I got my Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and I'm very grateful for it. But there, like any new technology, as any engineer will tell you, there's a learning curve for you to go from 0 to 9 billion. Doesn't matter if it's vaccines or widgets. It takes time to learn how to scale up new technology to that level. And that's why we have the global equity issue. But in terms of immunizing the American people, there were lots of ways to deliver the spike protein. It turns out COVID-19 vaccines or coronavirus vaccines, compared to some of our other vaccine targets, like malaria or some of the other parasitic disease vaccines we make, coronavirus vaccines are much more straightforward. I mean, you deliver the spike protein, you get virus neutralizing antibodies and T cells and P cells, and you're off to the races.
I got a ton of T and P cells myself, pretty proud of them. So I don't know what I just said, but I do think that based on what you're talking about, the development of the vaccines, including it's the variables are effectiveness and deliverability. And what you're saying is your vaccine is as effective and it can be delivered more easily, more widespread, to get to more people, save more lives.
And you can make more of it. There's no upper limit to the amount you can make because it's an older technology and there's capacity for using that technology to make vaccines in, you name it, Brazil and India and Indonesia and Bangladesh and Vietnam. And so if you need a vaccine that it could actually be scaled to the billions of doses, this is the one. And it's a technology that's been around for decades, and parents have been giving it. It's the same technology as the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine that parents have been giving to their kids for decades.
So we
think the acceptance is going to be really strong as well.
When do you know how your vaccine will do and be delivered?
Well, it's looking really good now, and the hope is the Indian regulators will greenlight it for emergency use authorization in India in a few weeks, and then get it also listed by the World Health Organization for emergency use listing globally, and we can start moving rapidly.
So when it comes to, there's the issue of global equity and access to the vaccine, and there's the scientific issue in terms of how the vaccine spreads. And one is a less selfish, the other is maybe more selfish, meaning if we don't vaccinate the world, then we're more likely to get more nasty variants that can overcome our current vaccine.
Well, yeah, because the Alpha variant, the B.1.1.7, rose out of an unvaccinated population in the United Kingdom last September, and the Delta variant arose out of an unvaccinated population in India earlier this year. And that's how these variants pop up, is when you have, when you allow the virus to circulate among unvaccinated populations. And the equity argument needs to be reframed. It's all focused around that all we have are mRNA vaccines, and we've got to share them. And, well, there's just not enough to share. I mean, there's nothing close to 9 billion doses of mRNA vaccines. And then, and to learn how to make that, like any new technology, will take years to make it in Africa and elsewhere. So, you have Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, were well-intentioned. They got up there and said, the company, Moderna and Pfizer have to share the recipe. I know what they mean by recipe, by patent, but even if they were to do that, it's still going to be years away before, because it's not just the factories even, it's the human capital to know how to scale it up under a quality umbrella with quality control and quality assurance. And the point is, we got to get these mRNA vaccines out of our head and realize that we need to vaccinate the world now. And I think, our technology is one of the only ones that you could rapidly scale for production. And it was always that way. And that was so frustrating for me in the early part of the pandemic, is I was looking at this and saying, yeah, they're really cool vaccines. And I love innovation. I'm an MD, Ph.D. scientist. But you're not going to vaccinate the world with this. We're going to be able to make just enough for a few 100 million people, at least in the beginning. And so help us, scale it up for the world. And we just couldn't get any help. We couldn't get help from the U.S. government or the international bodies. Fortunately, we were here in Texas and were able to raise a lot of private philanthropy funds here in Texas and a couple of New York-based foundations as well.
Is that because of the kind of the politics of the scientific vaccines?
Everybody, all the policy, it was an science policy failure. The COVAX sharing facility was well thought out, but there weren't the vaccines there to share. And so it was a science policy failure. Everybody was so focused on the innovation and what I call in my despair, the shiny new toys, and quick and speed and getting it into the arms of the American people and the Europeans, that no one took a step back and said, hey, wait a minute, can we actually make billions of this for the rest of the world? And the answer was no, they couldn't. And so the mistake was not balancing the portfolio with something like ours. So, and if they had done that, I think the whole world could have been vaccinated by now. But we're making rapid progress at this point.
We're making rapid progress at this point. We're talking here at the, beginning of September in 2021. What is your forecast moving forward in terms of these variants developing, more people getting vaccinated in undeveloped countries, and even our own if we don't do a better job? Although it seems like, I don't know, where are we at?
Well, where we're at, we've on a country basis, we've only vaccinated about half the country, and the reality is that it's not really half the country. It's 3/4 of the country in the north and 1/4 of the country in the south, where I am, and that's the vulnerable part. The southern U.S. Has still a huge percentage of unvaccinated people, and then the other conservative strongholds up in Idaho and Montana, and that's also looking pretty dire as well. So people are saying we're out of this now, and I'm saying no. There's still huge regions of the country that are vulnerable, and really a lot of smart people are saying this is over now. This is our last wave, but I'm looking at this and seeing a lot of warm water for the hurricane to pass over. The warm water being the unvaccinated, and especially in the Mountain West area and in the South. So last year at this time, the numbers were also going down. That summer wave was declining. And then after Halloween, starting in November, December, then it really ramped up again. So I'm still quite concerned that that's going to happen, although very smart people like Scott Gottlieb and others have said they don't think it will. So we'll see.
Word about the flu. The difference between last year and this year is people were not really going out nearly as much. They were masked up more likely. And I think a lot of scientists were surprised that the flu was not as bad as it usually is, but then maybe some weren't. But this year, the case is a bit different, but everybody needs to get their flu shots, right?
Yeah, and something really interesting happened, Pete, which was, when people were social distancing, there were other viruses that weren't being transmitted, like one called RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, which is a problem among little kids. And then when the kids started getting together, starting in the summer, we not only had COVID, we had a terrible RSV epidemic and a lot of hospital admissions from RSV. So on that basis, I think the CDC and Rochelle Walensky, yesterday or the day before, said watch out for flu because they're worried the same thing is going to happen, that it could be a very bad flu season. So get your flu shot. And you can get it at the same time as your COVID vaccine, but now's the time to get it, especially before you start commingling with friends and family over the holidays. This is the time to get it.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your time today. I really appreciate it. Anything you want to say here at the end, moving forward, looking ahead, something that you think is really important and is not getting enough attention, maybe?
Well, I don't want to be too pessimistic. I do think we can vaccinate our way out of this. But it's a high bar. We're talking 85, 90% of the whole U.S. population. It means that we can't have these big regional differences. And you're going to say, well, that's impossible. Well, it is possible. We do it every year for polio and measles and diphtheria and pertussis. But it took time to build the ecosystem. So the big unknown is how well we can reach conservative groups who are defiant of getting vaccinated. And it's just the most self-defeating thing I've ever seen. Pete, we've lost 100,000 Americans since the beginning of the summer, despite the availability of safe and effective vaccines. These are people who chose to risk their lives rather than getting vaccinated. And I don't even call it misinformation or disinformation anymore. I call it anti-science aggression. Anti-science aggression is a killer. It's now one of the leading killers of Americans.
No doubt about it. Have you been invited on by the Tucker Carlsons or the Joe Rogans or the people that are most likely to spread a lot of this misinformation? Have they ever invited you to their shows?
Well, I did in the beginning. And then, so I was going on Tucker Carlson and the whole crew.
You did Rogan a couple times.
Hannity and Joe Rogan. And then, I started, when Trump came out with the disinformation campaign, saying COVID was a hoax and hydroxychloroquine and the hospital admissions were catch-up and elective surgeries. I was one of the first to call it out, not because I'm so brilliant, but because I've been going up, because I have this daughter with autism, wrote the book Vaccines Not Cause Rachel's Autism. I've been about my daughter. I've been going up against anti-vaccine groups for years. So I can smell an anti-science disinformation campaign a mile away. Yeah. And I did, and I called it out. And it was tough to do that. But I think at that point, Fox News, it entirely cut me off. The nighttime anchors did. Some of the daytime guys hung in there with me for a while. And then with Joe, we had a great relationship before the pandemic. I even, went to a show in Houston and brought my son to me. I wanted my son to meet him. He was great. He's terrific. We've never exchanged a harsh word ever. And I loved going on his show. And so I thought he would be great to, go back on his show because he's so influential now. And, I just haven't gotten a response from him. But I think it could do a lot of good, because one of the groups that's really dug in against getting vaccinated are sort of, the young males who are going to the gym every day and think that's a substitute for virus neutralizing antibodies. And that's whose lives we're losing right now. So, I email them time to time saying, hey, I think this would be great, but we'll see.
natural immunity is not really going to do it. Doing your own research is not going to do it either. That's why I'm so glad I have access to an expert like yourself to be able to ask these questions to, and then share that conversation with so many folks. Thank you so much, Peter. It's so great to see you and hear you, and I really appreciate you taking the time here.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for giving a voice to all this, and wishing you all the best, and look forward to staying in touch.
How about it? Dr. Peter Hotez on Twitter at Peter Hotez. Go follow him and let him know that you heard him here on the show, an American hero who will go hopefully down in history as someone who saved potentially millions of lives. Great guy. Love talking to him, and so happy to have him back on the show. And that's what you get with your subscription. Amazing guests like him and my next guest. Access to them, because this guy is one of our favorites. He is our favorite historian. He is my favorite historical author. He has written so many amazing books, all of which I own, and you can too. If you don't already, you should buy them. These are great gifts right now. Thinking about the holidays? Go to don'tknowmuch.com. Don'tknowmuch.com. I guarantee you can find a book for a friend, a lover, a child, so much. Don't know much about the Bible, Civil War, geography, history. Don't know much about the American presidents, American hidden history. Don't know much about mythology, as well as More Deadly Than War, and his newest book, Strong Man, as well as Shadow of Liberty. I didn't mention that book. So many good books for you to read, to buy, to give as gifts. Don'tknowmuch.com. We talked Columbus Day, indigenous peoples, and all the politics that we're hearing surrounding the teaching of history in our schools, I think, which is where we started. Ladies and gentlemen, always great joining us. Always great to join us. One of your favorite guests, and you should follow him on Twitter at Kenneth C. Davis. Here we go with another lesson. I've got him, my favorite historian and author of history, Ken C. Davis. We are so grateful whenever you're able to join us. And today, our subject is Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day. Maybe we can talk Italian, since you and I both love talking all things Italian. It's certainly relevant. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
It's always a pleasure, Pete. As usual, I've said it before, we always have a lot of fun talking about history. It's not always fun, but it's fun to talk about it when you talk about it in terms of real people. And I said it to you before we started the recording session. I see such nice things after I was on last time. Your audience says very, very lovely things, and I'm very, very grateful that I get the opportunity to talk to your smart, beautiful, handsome, attractive audience.
They are all gorgeous people. That is true. Every one of them. We are going to get together at some point, all of us, and try to find out who is in fact the fairest of them all. I want to start by asking a general history question before we get to it. But how much have you thought, and forgive me if you've written about this, or if there is some kind of a specialist that does, the psychology of history? When we learn things about history that we don't like, that make us upset, make us feel badly, how does that manifest? What does it mean? Because I do think that gets to the crux of the debate that we hear today, that if we're teaching a certain kind of history, it's going to make you ashamed to be American or from whatever nation you're from. And I wonder about how much scholarship there has been on kind of the psychology of learning about history.
It's a really good and interesting question, and I can't say that I've read a lot about it over a long period and all of the scholarship. I have read a little bit about it recently because obviously this is a conversation that is not only taking place in academia, it's taking place in town halls and school board meetings where people are being physically attacked in some cases. School administrators are being bullied, beaten, spit at. People are being called Nazis. And it's a confluence of a couple of things that are related, obviously. First of all, the mask issue. A lot of parents are really up in arms over this mask issue. I'll just say right now, being something of an expert on pandemics and influenza and the spread of things, I'm completely in favor of masks. All of my experience with kids and masks is that they don't mind them. It's really the parents who have gotten this crazy idea put into their head that somehow this is an infringement on freedom. So I just want to be very clear on that. I think that the mask issue is yet one more straw man that has been put up by people with an agenda, simply because it hooks into people's very, very primal feelings. And that's so much of what's going on in the country right now is about making people angry, making people enraged. We know this from the Facebook testimony we heard about the other day. So all this is really connected. The other issue besides the mask is what we're teaching, who's teaching it, whose history do we tell? For 30 years, I've been talking about the fact that most of us don't know much about history. And some of us who learned history a while ago got a very watered down, sanitized, wishy-washy version of history that left out a lot of the facts and a lot of the accuracy. And there's been a great movement, an important movement, to introduce more of the reality of American history into our textbooks. And there's been a big pushback on that from the same people who are pushing back on masks. The two things really do link up together. So it's a really important issue, because I believe that history is about facts and accuracy, and that only if we teach an accurate, fact-based version of the past do we make some sense of it. Why do we need to make sense of the history? Well, first of all, it explains who we are and how we got here. In addition to that, the obvious one about learning from history, I've heard people say it so many times, the old cliche, those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. I think that's an oversimplification. We can certainly learn lessons from history, and we should learn lessons from history, whether it's about a pandemic or whether it's about 400 years of slavery in this country and the terrible cost that has created for this country in many, many ways.
So well said, of course, but I think, you talk about facts of history, but the question is, whose history is it? And so let's, answer that question by taking a look at, is it Columbus Day? Is it Indigenous Peoples Day? Should it be Italian American Heritage Day? Whose history is it? And, more specifically, if I were to drill down and say, how should history be taught of this day in public school systems?
It's a good and fair question. It's interesting. We're a little bit older, obviously, that our children and certainly my children 30 years ago, and perhaps your children today, are getting a very different history of Columbus than the one I got when I was a kid. When I was a kid, we learned 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, the great discoverer. We see him with the flag, planting it on the beach. He's bringing civilization and Christianity to this savage world. That was the image that we had, and it lasted for a long time. That was the image that was implanted in the earliest textbooks of this country. It was the reason that so many things in our country have the name Columbus or Columbia, including the District of Columbia related to them. This founding myth, this founding legend was very, very powerful. In 1892, for the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival, there was a major exposition. They called it the Colombian Exposition. And it was like a World's Fair type of thing. And they were making a big deal of how, great everything was since Columbus had arrived. And that really held on for a long time. By the way, the Pledge of Allegiance was written originally in 1892 in honor of the 400th anniversary of Columbus. A little historical connection. Huh. I should also add, at the time it was written, it did not include the words "under God." That was added in the 1950s to fight back against godless communism. But, when you talk to me about history, I start to...
I love it. I love that. We all love the nuggets. Go ahead.
So that's just one of the nuggets. 1892, we get the Pledge of Allegiance. But this idea of Columbus as the bringer of civilization. First first of all, obviously, he never set foot on what would become the United States of America. 4 voyages, most of us only learned about the first one, 4 voyages around the Caribbean to South America. He, saw Jamaica and Haiti and Cuba and all of the islands. I like to say, somewhat glibly, that he really discovered Club Med. But that was the notion, that somehow this man came, and in his footsteps came America. That overlooks a lot of important aspects of this, including the fact that they taught us when I was a kid that Columbus proved the world was round. Well, that's nonsense, because most educated people at that time knew that the world was round. There had already been globes. The Greeks had proved the world was round mathematically 1,000 years before. So this, that was really a false item of the history we were taught. In fact, I went on to learn that Columbus didn't even think the world was round. He thought it was shaped like a pear.
What?
Yes. Christopher Columbus thought the world was pear-shaped. There is a video on my website in which I explain this in detail. But basically, he was sailing, it's the 3rd voyage. He's sailing off the coast of South America. He sees a river rushing out. He thinks he's still off the coast of China somewhere. He decides, and he writes this down in his logbook, and that's why we can say this is a historical fact. Columbus wrote this. It's what we call a primary source document. Columbus writes that he's found one of the rivers that's mentioned in the book of Genesis that is around Eden, which Europeans at that time thought was an island off of Asia sometime. So it was very logical for him to think that if he saw this river and it was a good idea to write back to Europe and tell the people that he'd found the Garden of Eden, because that would just make them all the more interested in his voyages and continuing to fund them. So that's the first surprise. Columbus thinks he finds the Garden of Eden. But then he goes on to say that the water's coming down so fast, it's coming so swiftly, it must be coming from a very high point on the earth. And he decides that the world is not round, but pear-shaped, that the water is coming down from this high point. And then he goes on not just to compare it to a pear, but he says that this high point, which is the highest and closest to heaven, is like a nipple on the breast of a woman. So Columbus actually compares the world to a woman's breast. I just think he was a sailor too long at sea, perhaps, but these are the stories that they don't tell in my school books that I like to tell, because I'd certainly pay a lot more attention if they told me Columbus thought the world was shaped like a woman's breast.
I know. All of a sudden, you can see every teenager in the class.
Their ears perk up, and they start to take notes.
Were there any women on his ships?
There were no women on any of his ships, on the voyages at least. Return voyages, he would often take back captive women, and that's where we get to the other aspect of Columbus. The first thing he did after the first voyage, of course, was he left some sailors behind. They make a fortress. And then he decides he's going to bring back 20 natives, the people he called, I'm sorry that my office is falling apart here, phones ringing and books falling.
No worries.
But he decides he's going to bring back 20 or so of these natives who he had called Los Indios, the Indians, thinking that he was still in the West Indies. I'm sorry, the East Indies. That's where he thought he was still sailing around Asia, and these were the Indian islands. And so that's why he named these people Los Indios, the Indians. Something else, a significant mistake he made.
How did he get so?
When he goes back to Spain, he brings back native people to show off, and they are certainly going to be enslaved. They're being brought back as kind of souvenirs, but they're going to certainly be someone's servants. Most of them die on the voyage. Only 8 survived to make it back to Spain. They were dying off because of what we now know was the introduction of diseases to which these people, Native Americans, the islanders, and eventually the people in the Americas, had no natural immunity to these diseases, which were commonplace in Europe. diseases like smallpox in particular. So Columbus's arrival immediately begins the conquest, the enslavement of tens of millions of people, and also their eradication, largely through disease, but also through enforced draconian labor. Columbus made the people that were there, he saw that they had bits of gold in their ears or as earrings. He made them start looking for gold. And if they didn't come up with enough gold, they would cut a hand off. And if they didn't come up with enough gold after that, they would crucify them. Jesus. So this is a horrific period in human history. These stories were not told to us when we're growing up. Now, do you have to tell a third grader, Christopher Columbus came, but he murdered everybody? No, obviously you introduce these things at different levels. But certainly by the time that kids are in middle school, they should be aware of the incredible impact that Columbus has on his arrival. And for hundreds of years, until fairly recently, this day was still considered a day of celebration. I'll detour here just one more minute to say, how did it become a celebration?
Yeah.
Columbus Day was not a national holiday until the 1930s. A few states had begun to celebrate Columbus Day as a holiday, but it only became a national holiday in the 1930s when Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Columbus Day holiday under pressure, political pressure, almost as a political gift to the Knights of Columbus, which was a very, very significant Catholic service organization that was really standing up for the rights of immigrants, Italian and Irish. And by the 1930s had become a very potent political force in this country. So like a lot of our holidays, it also was a kind of bone tossed as a political favor. The Knights of Columbus pushed for this very hard. They had a lot of, at that point, political muscle, and so it was signed into law.
Any reason why it was in October?
Yes, because Columbus did arrive, we know from the dating of his logbooks, he did arrive at the island, which he named San Salvador, on October 12th, 1492. And the holiday always used to be, and certainly was when I was a kid, it was always celebrated on October 12th. In the late 1960s, they created all the Monday holidays and shifted holidays like Memorial Day and Columbus Day. Veterans Day was shifted and moved back to create the Monday holidays.
I did not know that. I don't think wow. That makes sense. 3-day weekends.
3-day weekends, yeah. So,
and more reason to shop and consume.
And always, yeah. And for some reason, Columbus was coat sales for a long time. I don't see too many indigenous people's sale signs. We still see Columbus Day sales. They tend to be for cars and mattresses and coats, so
good time to buy a coat, I guess.
It's always, commerce and these historic holidays have always gone together. There's nothing new about that. So this is a really a horrible piece of human history and a grim piece of American history that we have to really tell. Two other pieces of the Columbus story. One I touched on. It's Columbus who brings pigs with him on his second voyage. Why pigs? Because pigs are easily transported, a good source of protein. They forage for themselves. So it's a good thing to bring along with an army. If you're going to occupy for a while, you bring pigs along because it's a source of food. Those pigs may have also introduced some of the diseases into the Native American community, to which, again, they had no resistance. So Columbus and the arrival of disease, Columbus and the enslavement of the Native Americans, their eventual destruction, is part of the story. The third part of the story is one we don't really talk about too much, but it's a really important one, too. Columbus had, as I mentioned, put Native Americans to work, digging for gold, eventually farming. It was slavery. That was the Spanish system. The Spanish were very surprised to learn that the Native Americans were dying off in grievous numbers, partly because of the difficult circumstances, the slave labor that they were forced into, partly from the diseases, partly from the fact that they were being killed if they didn't turn up enough gold. So in 1515, this, about 20 years after Columbus's arrival, a Spanish priest talks about how terrible it is that the Spanish are treating the Indians this way. And he says, I have an idea. Let's, instead of using the native people for workers, let's bring Africans to our colonies in the Americas to work. So in 1515, the African slave trade really begins. So this is another ripple of history coming out from Columbus's arrival. And you can't separate any of these out from each other. And that's why this is such a really significant moment in human history, and certainly in American history, that it's worth really understanding. It's not just this happy day where this guy showed up on the beach and brought European ideals and civilization to the savages.
Yeah, none of this makes me think there should be a statue to him or a day named after him, but call me crazy. That is an argument that is happening, and there's a movement to rename the holiday, and it's gained traction in a lot of states and cities across the world, not just in the U.S., right? I mean, so that's right. It is a very much an international movement, and of course, there's pushback. There's pushback, as I mentioned, from those parents who want the traditional, nice version of history taught the way they learned it, 50 years ago. Or there's also pushback still from the Italian American community. Still feels that this is their day, and they don't want to surrender it, and they still see Columbus. Look, I've talked about how awful he was. What he did is also remarkable in human history. He had a brave, bold, daring idea. He was really mistaken on a lot of his understanding of what the world was shaped like. But what he did was an extraordinary feat of navigation and seamanship, and it certainly did change the world. And so it's important that we understand what he did and how he did change the world, but it's really important to put it into the right context. Context is everything in history. There's also so many great Italians, Americans, that we could, rename this day if you wanted it to be this Italian day. For, I submit, maybe like an Andrew Cuomo or John Gotti.
You're going to get me in big trouble, so I'm going to stay away from there. Enrico Fermi.
Oh, okay. He sounds great.
Fiorello LaGuardia.
So what about the Garden of Eden? Did he get it?
He didn't. He went to his grave, by the way, thinking he was still in Asia. Of course, Columbus was trying to sail west to get east. He thought there would be an easier way to get to China and Japan and the riches of the Orient, all those spices and silk and wonderful things that China had, which, they were so far advanced of European civilization at that point in so many ways that the Europeans were desperate to open up these trade routes. Columbus thought it would be much faster to go west than to go east, because to go east, you had to sail all the way down around Africa and up. It's a very long, treacherous journey. What Columbus didn't count on, of course, were there these two continents that would be sitting in the way. That lucky mistake, of course, changed history. By the way, I think it was his second voyage, one of the navigators along with him was Americus Vespucci, who was actually in the employ of the very wealthy Italian businessman from Florence, whose name for the moment is escaping me. I'm just drawing a blank here. The Medici. He was working for Medici, and he writes a letter back to the Medici and says, no, this isn't China. This is a new world. Huh. And because of that letter, Americus Vespucci writes back to Europe. It was determined that America, when it goes on the maps, should be named for him, not for Columbus, who was by that time kind of forgotten and disgraced. So the first maps that identify these new worlds as America are in honor of the man who wrote this letter that, no, this was not China, this was a new world.
Can't imagine anybody at this day and age wanting a whole country named after them, or a place or a building or anything like that, or having like their face carved into a mountain or something.
Well, Americus didn't. I don't think he was expecting it, and he's probably laughing somewhere in explorer's heaven about the fact that all this stuff has been named after him. But people have had big egos and named things and built things in their own honor for a long time. I guess we could start with the pharaohs of Egypt. You know?
That's a good point. Well, you wrote a whole book about a bunch of those men as well. So, and a book about, there's a lot of this is covered in Don't Know Much About History and America's Hidden History. And I don't know, I guess we can leave it there. I can't think of another Columbus related question unless you have anything else that you want to add to it.
It's a fascinating period in history. It's a fascinating piece of American history. It's a fascinating piece of world history. The complexities of how and why things happened, and this age, we called it when we were growing up the age of discovery, the age of colonization, but it was really an age of conquest. And when they said colonization back then, it didn't mean the same thing as it does today. Yes, these were colonizers, they were enslavers, and there was an extraordinary exchange of goods. That's part of this as well. You know, there was no tomatoes in Italy before Columbus.
Is that right?
Think about Italian food without tomatoes.
Wow.
And the first tomatoes brought back to Italy from the Americas were actually sort of yellow gold. And so they called them apples of gold, which in Italian, of course, as you know, is pomodoro. That's why tomatoes are called pomodoro. They're golden apples.
Wait, so are tomatoes pomodoro? Are they pomodori? Tomatoes, are they indigenous to the Americas?
The first tomatoes in Europe came from the Americas. That's right. Wow. There's also a belief. And there's been a lot of medical debate about this for a long time, that while Columbus brought great many diseases to the United States, the Spanish then returned to Europe with syphilis. That's in considerable dispute. There's evidence that syphilis existed in Europe before 1492, but there was a real outbreak of syphilis in Italy just after Columbus's arrival. And so people put those two things together and said, oh, Columbus must have brought these back from those savages in America. In dispute, but an interesting story that's come down over 500 plus years now.
I wanted to just ask you one more thing while I've got you today, kind of unrelated to Columbus Day, indigenous people, and all of this. But my friend Celeste Headley, who's one of the smartest people I know, the other day she tweeted, often when I speak about systemic racism, someone will quote Martin Luther King, that we should focus on the content of character, not color of skin. These days, if they do that, I ask them to recite one other sentence from King's speech. So far, none have been able to do it. You know, the question to you is, it's about taking history out of context to have the narrative that you want. And most people that celebrate or think they celebrate and respect Dr. King and the movement that he led really don't realize much about what the movement was about. So much of it was about opportunities obviously for voting, for education, for employment, healthcare, and just general dignity. It wasn't just that line, which is a good line, or that idea, which is a great idea, of not judging people by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. What would you say about taking things like that out of context, and specifically maybe about Dr. King?
Well, first of all, Celeste Headley and I are very old friends. You may not know this, but I was an early interview of hers when she was back on a radio station in Detroit many, many years ago. So
she is one of the finest, smartest, most courageous and articulate, brilliant, just one of my favorite people.
I am with you, and I've been on the radio with her many times, and I consider her a friend. So I'm delighted that you've had her on and connect with her.
Yeah.
Another point is, I think it's important, and something that you said there, and we touched on a little bit before, this idea of taking things in history and sort of helping them prove your idea. That's called confirmation bias, and we do it in a lot of ways. But people often cherry pick moments from history to say this or that about, and of course, unfortunately, these days with the internet and Twitter, a lot of what people have said or reputedly said is mistaken. So that's another problem separately. But people like to find things that seem to justify their view of, whether it's politics, religion, or anything else. So confirmation bias is a real thing.
Right.
Finally, to Dr. King's point, I've written and spoken about Martin Luther King many times over the years, and I always come back to the fact that he had 3 legs to the stool that he was sitting on. Racism obviously was the most important and the most visible, but he was talking also about economic justice, and the March on Washington was a march for jobs. And when he was going back again in 1968 for another march, it was really an economic march more than a racial crisis march. And finally, the third leg of the stool was his complete belief in nonviolence, specifically his opposition to the Vietnam War, which in the 1960s, early in the 1960s, is what got him labeled as a communist by J. Edgar Hoover and others. And certainly for Lyndon Johnson, Dr. King's opposition to the war became a problem because he wanted King to be his ally, but here was King saying that this was an unjust, immoral war and we should get out of it. So, everything's always much more complex than one line from one speech. Anyone could read all of the great majority of Dr. King's writings and works and know that, yes, he of course did say, we should be judged on the content of our character, but he also wrote much more about how the character of the nation was inherently racist. And to get to that point where that little black girl and that little white boy and that little red child could all play together, that image from that speech, that was going to require a lot of work. And I don't think that anyone should take from that the idea that Dr. King thought or even believed that this was a country that should be colorblind. He was far too aware of the fact that it was not a colorblind country. And that was truly the crusade that was at the heart of his work and ultimately what he's a martyr to.
I talk to you forever, my friend. I appreciate you joining me and talking about this important day in history here on Columbus Day, which is when I'm posting it for, and also a happy anniversary to you and your lovely bride.
Thank you. I'm wearing my Florentine tie that I bought 43 years ago on our honeymoon in Florence, and I've kept it ever since. And I always trot it out on this day.
Please don't spill anything on it. Thank you, sir.
Grazie mille.
Always great. Always great. There he goes. Kenneth C. Davis on Twitter at Kenneth
cdavis.don'tknowmuch.com. Go get his books. Tell him you heard him here. Thank him for joining us and teaching us, as well as Dr. Peter Hotez. And Mara will be back next week for Mara Mondays. But I thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope you had a day off. Appreciate you supporting the podcast. I'll see you Thursday night at our... Wait. Yeah, I can't do Thursday night because I'm going to be in Orlando. Maybe we could do Friday night. So the hangout is postponed until further notice. We'll try to do it Friday night when I get back if you want, or maybe you could suggest another time that we don't normally do that you'd like to do, maybe during the day. I don't know. But yeah, I'm going to be doing the event for the Florida Education Association on Thursday night, so I won't be able to host the hangout. But join me on Discord anytime, the Discord platform, if you're not already a member. Okay, you're never alone there, is what I like to say, because it's true. There's always people there chatting. All right, guys, I love you, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. I've got a lot more awesome guests coming this week. Let me know who you want to hear. As always, standupwithpete@gmail.com. Bye-bye. John Carroll, singer, subscriber, friend. Take us away, Johnny.
Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand